Welcome back to Autodesk Maya 2017. In this tutorial we're going to cover the importance of the pivot in Maya. So as you can see here, I have a couple objects on the stage here, and if we look at this, I have first off this cube sort of with an extrusion here, and you can see it. In order to move it, I'd have to grab the device from here. I'd have to rotate it or scale it from that same point. Well, typically when you're modeling, if you're going to move objects or animate them after a while, you're typically going to want to center the pivot a lot of times if they're just a free form object. Like pretend this is a spaceship. I know it's not, but imagine this whole unit as a moving object that I would want to animate. Well, we'd probably originally create controls for it, but if you were going to use the natural pivot of the object, you would still want the pivot to be centered. And the reason why is because we would then create a control, which would be a shape that would have that exact same pivot, and that way it'd prevent a problem which is called double transformations, where essentially if I created a shape that basically parented to this object and I could select it, say it was a big circle out here. Let's go ahead and create a nerves circle just real quick just to demonstrate this idea here. So I'm not going to actually create it, but pretend that this is parented to this. So when I select this, you can see the center point is here, right? And pretend that would be for the object. Well, if the object's pivot is a different pivot, you can cause transformations that are basically double transformations. If you start rotating this and then rotating this, you could create certain problems. So that's one issue. Another issue is typically when you're modeling, you want to have the object center in the stage. You don't want it to be rotated, and so you want to center your pivot. So in order to center your pivot after you've been working on it, and if it's been adjusted somehow, you can go to the Modify menu and go down to Center Pivot, and pretty much then that pivot will be centered. There are other instances where you want to modify the pivot based upon for animation. For example, this pivot here is centered to the stage here, but what if I want it to be like an arm and rotate around the axis here? You can see here I have some very simple geometry, but a cylinder and sort of an extruded sphere here. And you can see that they have pivots that aren't too far off from each other. They're a little bit different here and here. But if I was going to grab this object to rotate, you can see what a problem this would be. So what I would need to do is make sure the pivot is centered in here. So how would I go about this? Well, the first thing I would do is tap spacebar and go into one of these quad views that would work for me. It'll most likely be the side view or front view here, I should say. And I'm going to go into wireframe mode by hitting number 4 so I can see where I'd want this pivot. So I want this pivot to be right here basically and move it up. So you can do that by holding the D key. The D key allows you to access the pivot here. And now I can grab it and literally move it up to that point. Now, typically you need to check to see, if this was from different views, the pivot wasn't centered in the object. You could check that from different angles. So I could come over here to this other view and check it over here. And again, hit number 4 to go in wireframe mode. And I can see that it's fairly centered on the object, and it's about the right height. But if it was needed to adjust, I could hit the D key, and again I would be able to move this, and actually have it perfectly aligned with that cylinder in here. So now if we tap spacebar over here, and now if I go to E, which is the hotkey for rotation, I can now access this and rotate around there as if we have a rotating arm here. Basically, it's a basic pivot for animation. So other ways to access this pivot option is through the tool settings. If you double click on any of these tools, like the rotation tool or the move tool, you can edit the pivot right here. So if you click on the button, which is under the rotate settings, so if you see this collapsed, you can open it up, click on edit pivot, and you have the same option basically to move it up and down and so forth. Let's go ahead and uncheck that. The other important thing to understand about pivots is sometimes you have to change the rotation of the pivot based upon what kind of action you want. If, for example, if this was to be set to the stage, always in the center here, then having the axis orientation set to the world would make sense. But if I rotated the object, let's say, let me go ahead and should demonstrate this here for a sec. I'm going to set this back to 0, and I'm going to check that these all have been freeze transformations. You can see here that we have an issue here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Edit, Delete by Type, and History. Delete that history, and then Modify and Freeze Transformations, and that will zero it out. I like to usually do both of that for all my objects. So this one has does it have history here? Yes, it does. So I'm going to delete the history, Edit, Delete by Type, and History, and then Modify and go down to Freeze Transformations. Now I've set up hotkeys on my shelf to do this, but I just want to demonstrate where it's at. And now you can see the channels are all cleaned out, and this one's cleaned out too. Now what I can do is I can group these objects together. So I'm going to select all 3 of these and then hit Control G. And now I have a group, and I can call it whatever I want. I'm going to call it ARM, for example, here. And now I can select this object and rotate it, and we'll still rotate around this object. If I want to get to the group, I hit the up arrow, and you can see here is the object. So say I rotate this at a different angle, right? That's opposite of the world angle. And then if I select just the bottom piece and want to rotate using the world view, you can see what an issue this would be, because it would rotate on the wrong axis. It would basically rotate poorly here. So what we have to do is we have to rotate around the object or some other format. You can see the object lines now with the object. So now we can rotate and we have no issues here with the alignment. These other options here, you can do component, which will allow you to actually choose like a face or an edge to basically rotate around the object. And then the custom is if you did want to create your own custom sort of pivot, you can change that, modify it, and create that unique axis. So if I chose this, what I'd have to do is adjust these values here, and then that would be the custom pivot here. I can also choose gimbal. Gimbal, what it does is, if you notice, if we go back to object here, I can rotate from this axis, but if I click in here, it'll kind of go freeform here anywhere I want. Let me zero out these transforms here, bring it back. With gimbal, what it does is it doesn't allow you to do the freeform. You have to actually pick a particular axis. So the Z here, the Y, or the X. So that one's a little more useful in terms of, you know, having to select that specific one. And again, you can zero out your channels here. So that's sort of a basic overview of the importance of the pivot. It is very powerful and extremely important when it comes to animation, but it also is very cool for modeling. For example, if I want to center this object on the stage here, so it's centered here, what I can do is hold this and move it over and try and find that axis, of course. But if I have snapping to the grid allowed by clicking on this, I can literally snap to the grid and find that exact center point here. So yeah, let's see if I can find it here. So one over there, and now you can see the origin is exactly in the center here. Sometimes it takes a little bit of practice to kind of see that. Sometimes it takes just looking at it from different views. So you can see here that it is centered, and from this side you can also see that it is centered right down the middle there. Or actually this side it looks like it's not quite there. There we go. Now it's centered. So that's a basic overview of the importance of the pivot. Until next time, see you soon in Autodesk Maya. Cheers.